This is Remote Ruby.
Have you any remote idea to the meaning of the word?
What's up?
What is up? Feel like I haven't been here for 2 weeks.
I feel like I haven't seen you in a while. It's weird because I'm used to seeing you a lot.
I know. It was funny because we moved into the house and then a week later we're like, oh, vacation for 2 weeks. So This brand new house, you kind of unpack like the bare minimum, towels and clothes and whatever. But now we're like back for good and I can't find anything. And then you have to decide what drawer should these things go in and what should this go in. You know that you're going to pick some location for it that's not going to be ideal once you live there. And it's interesting to see do those decisions stick? Are they permanent? And you're just going to get used to the inconvenience, or do you actually get tired of it and you're like, all right, we're moving this to another drawer or whatever.
Right. I'm a big fan of the label maker. Mm-hmm. I don't own one because if I did, it would just be a disaster because everything would be labeled. And also because at some point I had this brilliant plan where I was going to create some sort of inventory tracker app in Rails and put QR codes or barcodes on everything I own. I don't know why. It was just this idea.
Why not?
It would be nice to know what I own and have inventory of it. But that's just a ridiculous statement.
That's awesome. Yeah, I remember looking for my label maker 2 weeks before we were moving. And you know how sometimes you're like, yeah, I'm going to put this in a place where I'll remember it. And of course, that is the place where you never look. So It's here somewhere. I never found it. I don't know where it is. My intentions were great, but yeah, nothing got labeled. Luckily, I don't have a whole lot of stuff myself.
Yeah, same.
There was a lot of random kitchen things and whatever else that took up a ton of space. What's wild is we had a tiny kitchen, but every cabinet was full. Things were sitting on top of the cabinets. And yeah, it turned out there's a lot more stuff in there than I thought. But in a weird way, I'm unpacking stuff and thinking about the similarities to refactoring code. And you're like, I'll put it in this module here or whatever. And then you're like, no, it doesn't make sense. And it feels very similar.
But just extract it away in a drawer.
Yeah. Your active support concerns are all across the floor.
Yep. I don't know if you saw this, but this week, Colin and I were on the Rubber Duck Dev Show live stream together. That was a ton of fun.
Yeah, I saw you guys were going to be on there, and then I was going to join in the chat and stuff, but then the irrigation guy showed up that night, and this is my life now. I didn't want this, but here we are. How was that?
Yeah, it was a ton of fun because I asked them, they were like, hey, we're about to have Colin on. Would you be interested in coming? And I was like, what if we both came? And Colin was down with it. So a lot of people showed up in the chat, I think more than usual. So that was a ton of fun. And there was some great discussion.
We're on there a long time ago, if I remember right. Because I think that's where I first learned of it.
Yeah, a few months ago.
Yeah.
A while ago, I wanted to start doing more live streaming and I bought some more equipment. I bought a new camera, although I'm kind of disappointed with the camera, but that is what it is.
What camera did you get?
The Elgato face cam.
Oh, okay. Uh-huh.
It's just not it, but we move. But
the fancy DSLR and it's fine, but ideally you get a camera that you can run the audio through. So there's a $400 XLR interface and I want to use this with my iMac and my laptop. So it's really easier if you had two microphones, one for each, and instead of the splitter or something, it just is.
Right.
Yeah. So I would love something simpler the face cam or whatever, but they're still not quite the same quality and not yet.
It's definitely not the same quality, and it has these weird things that I don't like about it. If my memory starts going up, then the video will start to glitch. And these green bars, I'm sure you've seen it since we get on calls every day, or not every week, but the green bars will start to shoot across the camera until the memory goes back down. It's really frustrating. Yeah. And it's just, come on. And because my other camera, the $15 one that I bought in college, doesn't do that. It's like, come on.
Right. I like most of the stuff that I've gotten. I wanted one of those. What's the Stream Deck or whatever?
The deck, yeah.
Yeah. I thought that would be super nice to have, but I love their like Wi-Fi lights. Those are awesome.
Do you use Alfred?
Yes.
Alfred has an app on the App Store. I don't know if you know about this, but what it basically is it allows you to create your own Stream Deck. Or basically allows you to configure it with actions that exist inside of your Alfred workflows, or, you can create quick actions and searches and all this other stuff. So I have like my iPad right below my computer right now. And what I will usually do is I've built out like a dashboard, a work dashboard, and like a personal dashboard. So like on my work dashboard, it'll like have a couple of subdomains. So like localhost and to like the production app that I can just tap on the iPad and it goes straight there. And you can use it on your phone too. It also allows you to like control your computer from your phone, because like with Alfred, you can restart and you can use the terminal and all these other things. So pretty cool. So you might want to check that out if you have an iPad.
Yeah, I will. Yeah, I use Alfred every day. Alfred's awesome. I came back and was like, Alfred 5 came out while I was on vacation or whatever. So I haven't checked out any of the new stuff there. That's pretty sweet.
I got that. I've been in focus mode on work, and exhausted afterwards. So I haven't had a chance to play with it, but I instantly upgraded. I was looking, and this is a quick aside. We're going to go to Ruby soon, I promise. Raycast has all the rage right now. And I was looking into their packages because there's a few plugins that they have. I'm like, I would really like that in Alfred. And when you really break it down to it, it's like, oh, I can just recreate this in Alfred really quickly because they're just bash commands or they're just JavaScript functions or whatever they are. It's more so like, oh, this is how you do it. That's what's been most interesting about looking into some of the plugins. Oh, that's the command they're running to do that. Okay, so now I could just rewrite this in Alfred.
Yeah, I need to do some more of that. I've been getting everything set up. Oh my God. I've probably installed 8 different apps lately of like, my garage doors have Wi-Fi control.
Right.
And honestly, like, I didn't want any of that stuff for the most part, but just like buying new things these days, it just has Wi-Fi out of the box or whatever.
Right.
And like, we were on vacation and we had a delivery come that we didn't know was going to come that day. And they call me and they're like, hey, is anybody home? And I was like, no, but wait, I can open the garage door from the East Coast and like let you in. And that's been pretty sweet. Oh God, everything is Wi-Fi connected. Our like ovens Wi-Fi connected. So like last night we're making dinner and then my phone was like, hey, oven's preheated. And I was like, what?
Fancy.
So that's cool. I mean, not that useful, but it might be if you're like doing a ton of stuff and you get that on your watch and it's like, oh yeah, I'll go back and do that.
Most apps either now they're starting to add shortcut integration, but almost all of them support X callback URLs. And so you can build shortcuts on your like phone and on your iPad and even on your Mac now too, to like basically start integrating with all these products. I think the hardest part of it, it's like, okay, now I know how to do all this. It's what do I actually want it to do? You know?
Right.
What are my actual workflows now that I've built out this really complex system?
Yeah, there's a lot of it that's just, okay, I have access to do things, but what's actually practical and actually useful?
Right.
It feels pretty limited at a certain point, but it's convenient too. Being able to be like, oh, I'm in bed and somebody left the oven on, turn it off from my phone. That's cool. But
yeah,
it's not like you're like, oh, I'm going to automate my oven to turn on every day at 4:30.
Yeah.
So I can make dinner. It just doesn't make sense to do some of those things.
I know people who do that though, and it's super cool, but it's like, how often do you use this? You know,
yeah.
Like, are you flexing or do you actually use this all the time?
What I was watching, like, I forget the name of the YouTube channel, some guy that just does videos about home automation stuff. And it's all like, oh, it's nice, but he's just like doing random things just because he can. And it's not almost any of them that I was watching was like, he's not going to use that every day.
Right.
Or even once a month, frankly.
Right.
They're just like, oh, look what I can do. I just wonder how many of these things are going to get hacked and start sending out spam emails like our pool.
Yeah.
Our pool equipment, you can connect to it remotely and you just plug in the ID of your system and there's no password by default.
No.
So it's just, well, I could go run through every permutation of the IDs. It's kind of like an IP address format. So
Right.
it's like pretty predictable. I was like, we could probably go turn up all these different people's pools or whatever. And I'm like, that's such a weird thing that I don't want connected to the internet. There's hardly ever going to be a time where I'm not home and want to turn off my pool or something.
Right.
It's weird.
Well, the unfortunate things about things like that, like when you're like, okay, what is the actual damage if someone were to get in there and you heat up that pool, right? It's not a lot. But the problem with things like that is that those are what people use to really harass people, because like you can yank up someone's energy bill doing that, right? And it's like a way to harass people online. And it's, come on, like we should add a password for God's sake.
Right. How do you not have it generate a password by default or something?
Yeah.
Like require one. Come on. It's strange. There's some stuff that's really, really nice to have though. Like I got to do that video still on the air quality sensor. Really want to get that one up and running in my office now because we have drywall dust everywhere and whatever. It'll be really cool to see the air quality, and we have a cleaning company to come through and clean out all the ducts and all that. So I want to get it running before then and see after they clean just how like good the air quality goes. And I remember like, doesn't Basecamp or something have like an air quality? DHH had talked about air quality a long time ago.
I think it's Tenderlove.
Tenderlove wrote the library that I use in Ruby for the air quality sensor. But I think Basecamp and DHH talked about it previously and like have a stipend or something for.
Oh, yeah. I know what you're talking about.
Sensor. So
yeah,
it's one of those where like when you're reading about it, you're like, hey, I'm actually sitting in this room and breathing. And if there's not fresh air, then carbon dioxide goes up. And that's like, okay. But if I knew that, then I could actually open the door, turn a fan on or something and maybe not be as sleepy at 2 p.m. or something. Just kind of cool. So I don't know. It's fun stuff to fiddle with though, but
absolutely
not life changing.
Speaking of gems, it sounds like you've been mining this week.
Yeah. Came back from vacation and was going through emails, trying to finish up some stuff and like pay version 4 is done. And there's some nuances left to do around things like pause subscriptions. So Colin and I have been fiddling with that a little bit, and we're using the database columns for things that are generally shared across all of the payment processors. But for some of the one-off features like pausing a subscription, Paddle does it very different from Stripe, and Braintree doesn't have that, and yada, yada, yada. So we like store all of the data that we actually need in a JSON column for some of those extra things. And so Colin was working on that a bit this week, trying to make it like more consistent. And of course, we go down the rabbit hole of like, all right, we're building a gem, not a Rails app. And the gem intentions are to support Rails 6.0 and higher, but 6.1 introduced such and such feature. And so we need to like, well, that's what it was. The checking which database adapter you're using. There's a feature method call that's introduced in 6.1. So we can like use that if it responds to that, otherwise fall back to the old one. And we were like, it'd just be nicer if we could just use the new thing all the time. You probably could in your gem add that feature into Rails 6.0 and backport the feature temporarily so that the rest of your library code could. But yeah, that can be maybe a little risky to do if it was something more complicated than just that. But we ran into that. Then we're like looking at the JSON queries between SQLite and MySQL 2 and Postgres, and SQLite, which gets installed on your Mac, is like one version before the double arrows were introduced. And if you homebrew install it, you can get that, the latest version. But then if you're using like Ubuntu Linux, CI on GitHub Actions is going to use either, well, I think it's still 20.04 and 22.04 is still in beta. So they haven't upgraded the default to that. Those have old SQLites that don't have that. The feature got introduced like in February this year, But we were like, oh, it'd be nice if we could just use that arrow function between all the databases. And of course not. You have to use, if you want to be backwards compatible, we have to use all the old stuff, which means we have to have a conditional for each database type in there and make the right query. Even if we were to use the same function, MySQL 2 prefixes stuff with like $, dot, and the attribute name. And if you do that in Postgres, it just returns null because it's literally looking for that name with the $sign in it. So even if we could use that same thing, we'd still need conditionals. And it's been one of those things that, you know, if you write Rails application code every day, you're probably on a specific database and a specific Rails version. That's the only thing you need to be compatible with. But when you're writing the library, you've got lots of permutations of Rails versions, database versions, or databases, database versions, Rails versions, Ruby versions, yada, yada, yada. You end up with a ton of crap that you have to support and try and be compatible with. So it's been an interesting week for him to like go through that and then also look at the APIs because they're different too. A pause subscription in Stripe is status of active, which kind of makes sense because on your billing page, if you had a subscription that's paused, you still want to see that. So it's active technically. It just doesn't bill you for it. But like Paddle will make the status as paused. So we have to like reconcile that too. And it's an interesting challenge. It's not a fun one or not one that feels like it pays any dividends to do all that work for backwards compatibility.
You don't remember what version of SQLite did introduce the arrow, do you?
3.38 that came out in February. So one version too short on Ubuntu Jammy. And I didn't see anybody that was doing like a PPA for it that would make it easy. You can like download and either compile it or download a pre-built binary and drop it in. But the one out of the box will not be updated for another 2 years for an LTS release, which sucks. So
yeah, because I'm on the developer build of like the latest Mac. So I was like, oh, maybe they did upgrade it. Let's see, but it doesn't appear so.
And that's pretty easy actually. If you do Homebrew and you just put the Homebrew SQLite path in your path, then it's not too bad. But if you're like trying to run stuff against SQLite in CI, you're going to have to like supply that binary. And it's not just as easy as, oh, we'll just run the latest SQLite Docker container because it's not a service. It's just a file system thing. So
right,
it's not quite as simple as, you know, upgrading a CI to a Postgres 15 or whatever.
Yeah. I mean, I've obviously used SQLite, but I've never had to go deep into the differences like you are. And yeah, I don't envy that at all because I'm barely competent enough with just SQL alone. I mean, I was trying to write a query yesterday and Jason's on vacation, which we didn't mention, but that's why he's not here. And he just abandoned me alone to write this SQL query. And that was cool, I guess. But like, come on, bro. But I was like, okay, I can figure this out because I've been writing more SQL. And whenever I need help, Jason's always like, okay, here, and then helps me out. And I'm like, I'm starting to get more confident. And I was trying to do something yesterday and I was like, oh, this function doesn't exist in Postgres. This is only MySQL server or something. And I'm like, oh my God, this is just really, I'm like, I thought I found the perfect aggregate function. That's not it.
People talk about SQL being the same as if it's a thing. And it's like, well, it's American English versus British English or whatever. Like, yeah, it's pretty similar, but it's not exactly the same. And it doesn't get interpreted the same way. Yeah, as much as it sounds like it's all a single thing, it's not. And yeah, fun stuff. I just want to take a minute to thank our sponsor, Honeybadger. They are not only my favorite error and uptime monitoring service, but they've also added several awesome new features. One of those being the public status pages. So it makes perfect sense that your error and uptime monitoring tool can have a public status page for you to communicate any downtime outages with your customers. So whether US East 1 is down or you forgot to add a configuration file, Honeybadger is there for you to help communicate any downtime or outages with your customers. Plus, they've also added SSL certificate monitoring. So like many of us use these days, Let's Encrypt certificates expire every 90 days. And if for some reason you're a week away from expiring an SSL certificate, they could let you know ahead of time so that you can take care of it without any outages for your customers. Plus, managing the errors and things inside of Honeybadger has gotten even easier with Honeybadger Actions, which you can use to automatically assign errors to yourself or another team member, add tags to different error classes, and more. And they also have batch actions, which you can use on the search results to help manage your backlog of work to do. So Honeybadger is the place to check out for error and uptime monitoring, and it's only getting better. So check them out at honeybadger.io.
If you were just to think like how much extra code is it to have to support all these different things?
Not a whole lot. I mean, we try to avoid querying the JSON columns and stuff anyways. So in theory, like querying the paused functionality might just mean that we would introduce a paused Boolean or something. I was talking to Colin about this. We could end up modifying the status from Stripe and saying, hey, if it's active but it's paused, we could change the status in our gem to write it as paused instead of active. But there's like a whole balancing act of writing a library is like, how true to the original API do we keep it? Do we want to abstract that? Generally, we're like integrating with Stripe. So I would say no, we don't want to do that, but we could. And yeah, I think for a lot of that, the thing you have to think about with it is for Postgres, we recommend using JSONB instead of the JSON format. And then like MySQL and SQLite don't have that. I don't know how much slower it is to query a JSON column in MySQL or SQLite versus the Postgres JSONB and whatnot, or the indexable, that sort of stuff. So it's one where it's ideally for a library, you're probably using that just for storing metadata, and it just isn't necessarily going to be equally performant for all of them. So it's a lot of those little trade-offs and decisions of like, okay, that'll be a breaking change if we go and introduce now a pause column, but it'll improve performance and whatnot. And we can like introduce the queries right now without doing that. And we could see how it works, and maybe it's not fast enough. Maybe it's whatever. We haven't had the feature yet. So this is all new anyways. So for the most part in the code, the extra work we have to do is just check the database adapter and then write a different query. So it ends up being a case statement wherever we need to do that, which is not a ton, but it ends up being like, we can't put it in a scope because I want my scopes to be short generally. So we'll end up making like a class method and doing the queries there and treating them like a scope or whatever. But it's pretty minimal because we're only doing that one or two places. But if you were doing more advanced stuff than we need to do, then yeah, it probably would be a lot more work.
Whenever you're like evaluating these types of decisions, do you ever like try to write performance tests or benchmarks or something to evaluate those assumptions? Or do you kind of just do like research and like, okay, I know this will be slower, or kind of how do you even think about performance at all in a gem?
That is always going to be something to think about. You want to make sure that you're not writing stuff that's, it's like this being payments code. It's going to be checked, queried regularly, maybe every request. So you don't want that to be slow. And we may like go back and we'll write out this stuff and see, is MySQL going to index the JSON column in an efficient manner? Can SQLite do that? Can Postgres do it? If so, then like we're good with, as long as the indexing of it can be done right, we can just use that query probably. But then we'll also probably make a branch and do the other version, which would require like adding a new column for the paused Boolean and then indexing that and then getting everybody who upgrades that version to go backfill that column. Maybe since it's a newer feature, nobody actually has to backfill it, which would be good, but it's still one of those things where you're like, okay, if we go and do those bigger changes, then how do we communicate that with the users? We got to make sure it's like a major-ish version bump because they got to do work to upgrade. And that's what gets hard. And I'm like, always want to avoid that if I can, but sometimes you can't. So I would always try to keep that in mind when you're doing the database stuff. They all operate differently. So if you're going to do something that's often queried, then yeah, probably worth doing your testing and slap 100,000 or million fake subscriptions in the database across a bunch of users and then query those and index them and then query them and then see like what's happening. One of the things that I kind of did, and this reminded me of that, was there was a point where there's a few things that we do that are trying to be like lazy loading. So like when you create a pay customer for Stripe, we try to avoid the API call to Stripe to create the customer until it's needed. And that way you're not just creating a bunch of unused Stripe customers in your API. But that gets a little tricky. And you want to make sure that like, hey, this code is either making 1 or 2 API calls or database queries, same kind of thing. If you're like, well, let's check to see if the user exists. And if they don't, then we'll go create them on the API and create them in the database and then query for the subscription or whatever. We do that too, just kind of like in a few tests of this should generate 1 query. It might do 2 queries if the Stripe customer doesn't exist yet. It has to go create them and do an extra thing. And so it's kind of nice to be able to like have some tests that are just high level, like this should generate 1 query, this should generate 2, and do the same kind of things with API requests so you can keep an eye on as things get more complex, keeping it performance still important there. And
yeah, it's interesting. I'm just curious because now I'm thinking about gems a lot all of a sudden now that you've brought this up, because I've been writing payment code for the past 6 months, pretty much straight. And payments are very important. So tests are very important. And when you're using a library to manage that, there's a little bit of fear that I would have personally. Obviously, if there's a breaking change, you can roll back the version upgrade or whatever. But now that RBS is, I think, becoming better, more integrations, more tools, have you ever considered like adding some typing support?
I haven't even honestly played with it much. That would be awesome to do. We have some methods that you can call that are like on a subscription, swapping the plan to a monthly to yearly or something. We have like a main interface that everything implements. And so some of them might return like a Stripe subscription, and another one might return the Braintree subscription, and so on. And so like it would be really nice to have a hint at some of those that were like, well, all of the main ones are going to return you the pay models back, but some of those will actually return you like the specific object that the Stripe or Braintree or Paddle libraries return. And it would be really nice to have some of that hinting in there for people to use and have sort of an expected response. And same thing goes for like calling the functions anyways, because you can say, I want to subscribe to whatever plan. And if you're going to Stripe or you're going to Braintree, they support 50 different options that are different and don't in any way relate to do the same things. So it would be super nice to be like, well, you're on a Braintree subscription, so you can pass in all these extra options. And we try to like say, hey, if you give us the number of days for your trial, we'll like take that and convert it to whatever Stripe needs and convert it to Braintree. And so we can build our own abstraction, but you can always pass in everything that Stripe would accept. You just have to know that you're calling Stripe when you call the method call with all those arguments. So it's one where almost having the pattern matching of other languages, being able to implement those and kind of skip the interface there would be kind of cool, just to have this is clearly going to handle a Stripe subscription of this format. That would be kind of nice to have separate implementations of those sometimes.
Yeah, I pulled out RBS again recently just to kind of mess with something because I had this idea that didn't actually pan out. But when I was doing it, it made me realize how much more consistent I was making the return types of my methods. All of a sudden, it's like, oh, well, why does this method with a very similar name return this very different object, but this one returns a string or something? And all of a sudden it's kind of easier to think through and visually see like, okay, well, the API for this class isn't very consistent. And I now have a way to make it more consistent and also have that safety of the types.
I think that's such a good point to make, that if you write Java or you write, a typed language, you are required to think about that thing when you define the method, but you don't have to in Ruby, which is kind of nice. It's kind of convenient to think about it as you flow through and you're like, okay, I want to send this stuff over here, and then we process it and then we return whatever back. But like, it really helps to think about all of that when you define the method in the first case, when you say like, this is going to accept this and it's going to return this. Everything in between can be whatever the hell it needs to be, as long as it follows these rules. That's one of those good reasons I think a lot of people will say, write your tests so that you can think about that ahead of time, then implement the logic as needed. Doesn't really matter what it needs to do, but you've already defined the like contract that give me this, I'll give you that. And if you aren't consistent about that, you'll end up with stuff like Paddle's API, where if you retrieve a subscription from their API, like give me this specific subscription, it has like state, but if you have the webhook for the subscription, it will be like status. And it's the exact same thing.
No.
And I was like, oh my God, for a company to be doing that on their API, I was like, that was one of those that I realized really quickly. Like, if you aren't paying attention, you can make some serious mistakes like that. They're fine. You can live with that, but you never want your code to be inconsistent like that.
You just reminded me of a thing we ran into when rewriting our checkout at Podia, where when you're creating a payment intent, you can update or create one, and update takes sometimes very different, well, not completely different, but sometimes it takes different things. And we ran into a situation where under a specific condition of the certain way a payment intent was created, it couldn't be updated. Mm-hmm. And we hadn't seen that before. And it's all of a sudden it's like, wait, why? Why can I update all these other things, but I can't update this? Like, why can't y'all just handle that?
Yeah. Interesting.
So
I ran into that with them. You create a subscription in order to render their payment element. And then if you have anything that applies a promo code or you accept the billing address, then going back and editing the subscriptions customer, there was no step to be like, hey, let's update the payment intent automatically from Stripe's side. And that was a weird thing to me. It's just not keeping it in sync. And I know they're working on it, and that should be hopefully fixed here soon. But yeah, those nuances can be really, really bad when you're like a black box like Stripe is. We'll never know the implementation of Stripe. At least if you were using Pay and someone was confusing, or Rails, you just jump in the GitHub repo and look at it and see what it does and what it expects. But if it's a black box, then you're screwed. You got to go do a bunch of tests and just gamble around and see how it works and try things.
Yeah.
It's real slow and not fun.
I mean, I'm running into that right now as we speak. For some reason, with the new element, it can have Afterpay and Google Pay and Apple Pay and all these options to pay with. And for some reason, they just don't show up. And I'm like, I don't understand. And there's no way to know why.
Yeah, I noticed that Google Pay and Apple Pay were not working for the payment element for me either. If you go to their demo, they just show up on Stripe's site.
What's even more frustrating is that sometimes they'll show up in production, but not locally. And because of the way things are working locally, but you have no idea what condition specifically is causing it to not work locally. You just know it doesn't work locally.
That's a really interesting one. When you hit their API and you get a response back that's like an error, they're very good at explaining like, this customer you used looks like one in production, but you tried it in development, and you're like, oh, yes, of course. But when it comes to like the JavaScript side of things, you almost need like a debug flag and then it to print out all these like, okay, we're going to try Google Pay. It didn't work because of X, and just have it explain that to you. That would be amazing.
Right. Yeah, especially because they're configured. So they know which ones are enabled for your account already.
Yeah, you like go into your dashboard, turn them all on, set up whatever you need to for some of them. And then your impression as the developer is like, we turned it on, it should show up. Because all I do is say render the element and then things aren't there. And you're like, what?
Right now, I have this issue where I've enabled Afterpay in production. And so it should just be there. And then I was like, it's not there. Why is it not there? And so I finally somehow figured out, oh, well, apparently in order to use Afterpay, you have to send them a shipping parameter when you create the payment intent, which has an address and a name on it. And I'm like, oh, okay. Right. So I updated my code to do that. It's still not working. And I have no idea why. And my only idea as to why is that when we first create the payment, we create it without the shipping address. And then we update because if it's a new user and we don't already have their address, we create the payment intent and keep trying to update it as the information is added. So when the billing address is added, then it will be updated on the payment intent. When it works, it's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. And my only idea is like, maybe it has to be created with it. And that's the only way it'll show up. That's what I'm gonna have to try after we get off this call. And if that's true, I'm going to call you back and just lose it live.
Yeah, because that one will be like a clear limitation of the API that you didn't know about and you just discovered because it wasn't documented or whatever. And yeah, I think it's especially important to have something like a debug flag for cases like that because, Afterpay, I don't know if it works in every situation. I know that like you're talking about 6 different types of payments. Some of them are vouchers that like you have to go take to a store to pay for things or whatever. And then there's bank debits that don't actually get validated for like 6 days sometimes. Especially with Google and Apple Pay, the types of subscriptions have to match what Google and Apple Pay accept as well. And that might be why some of them don't just show up or whatever. But if you don't have any feedback on that, you're talking about a whole list of green check marks of payment features that you're like, okay, cool, we should be able to use these. And then you have to go through and figure out all of the nuances yourself. And that is very time consuming. And part of the reason why you're like using the API in the first place, it's supposed to simplify things for you. And you're like, well, it's not really doing that enough. At the end of the day, this stuff is really complicated, which keeping all their APIs up to date with always new features and their docs changing constantly because the API is changing a lot. It's got to be tough for them and they're growing so fast. And I'm sure it's very hard, but it's got some rough edges still.
It is nice that their developer advocates are great. I mean, they have a Discord where you can ask questions like shout out CJ. He's awesome. I mean, we talked about our subscription woes a few episodes ago, and I mentioned that at RailsConf, CJ helped me a lot. And he continued to help us and even connected us with some members of that team so that we could explain, what we were trying to do, what wasn't working. And they were like taking notes. Okay, we'll definitely take this into consideration. So that part's great.
They're quick to respond to those things. And
absolutely.
Yeah, that's what I like about Stripe is they're actively looking for feedback. They're trying to make it as good as they can. You're not going to get that from Braintree or PayPal or whatever. It's just not the same level of care, which is why I like Stripe so much. It's by far the easiest, yet not still as easy as you would like it to be. The early days of Stripe where it was like, hey, create a token, charge the card, you're done. Pre-SCA, pre all the like Google Pay and Apple Pay, none of that really existed. It was so simple back then. And supporting all this other stuff is wonderful, but ads, I can't imagine on their back end, like how much pain and complexity they have to deal with to support all that stuff. It's gotta be wild. So we're probably lucky that we don't have to deal with the internals of payments, engines and stuff. Have I ever told you about, so my first job as a Rails developer, what was the name of it? I don't remember. There's some payments company that was for like marketplaces before like Stripe Connect came out. And we were looking at using them We had to FTP files to make transactions. And it was like some text format that was like the first character needs to be one of these, and then the next 3 characters or whatever. And I was sitting there like my first Rails job, and they're like, yeah, you're going to do payments. And I was like, oh no, I don't want to be FTPing files and then waiting a few seconds and then downloading the response.txt or whatever it was. And it was just wild, very outdated, very old stuff. And I'm sure that's what they have to deal with internally in Stripe, but oh my God, it was so bad. And then we found that other startup that was like the marketplace thing, and they existed for like a year or 2 and then we're gone. But we like got to use that API and it was way, way easier, but still it was terrible back in 2011, 2012, whatever that was.
Right. The last thing I'll say about Stripe is that something that's really nice that they do that other companies should take after is the fact that they have 4.2, 4.2, 4.2, 4.2, et cetera. Or they have all these test cards you can use that will trigger certain responses. Like I was using a different service and it wasn't working. It was like invalid. It was like, okay, because maybe this is because I'm using fake data and they're actually trying to validate it. So I'm going to the docs. I'm like, okay, maybe they provide like a valid one you can use and develop it. No, they only, but you know what they did provide? Invalid. They provided one invalid option and that was it. There's no valid option. And I'm like, oh my goodness. So
they're like,
I think that's
we want your real credit card information to test.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know what I was doing the other day. It was stuff on Stripe and maybe it wasn't that, but it was something related to the bank accounts, I think. And it gave me like 6 buttons to click that were like invalid with this reason, and success and whatnot. And it was like such a nice thing because you can go and write your capybara tests or whatever to just click the correct button. And then you can test all those scenarios and you don't even have to code that into your tests and put in the special thing. You just have it click the right button that you would do if you're manually testing. And I was like, oh, this is so good. I like the demos where they're like, here, let's go show you Stripe checkout or whatever. And then here's a test card that's successful. Here's one with taxes or whatever. And the thorough demos are phenomenal. And they also are a really good thing to build in to your Rails app. If you have Podia in development and you want your boss or Spencer or like anybody who's not a developer to go play with the staging site, and you can show them, hey, use this email and password to log in as this type of user and whatever. You can like build that into your staging and development and test environments and leave them out of production, but give your employees the same power internally. That is like some awesome experience to have.
Yeah. And we actually do that at Podia. I figured you probably do. Yeah, because there's different parts of the applications, right? You have a Podia site where you're selling some courses. That's one section of the app. And then there's another section for like when you as the creator going in to edit or create your courses and, all this other email manager community, all this other stuff. That's another part. And then there's an admin part. So when you run the seed command, it creates a user for each of the different sections because they all have different logins, and it sets them up with courses and fake data and all this other stuff. It's really nice to get up and running.
Yeah, because there's so many different configurations and whatever that if you're to manually try and test those things, you'd have to go spend 20 minutes setting up an account and changing all these little things to get the right set of circumstances just to go test the one new feature that you changed or whatever. So yeah, that is invaluable.
I think, though, I want to highlight very much so what you said, that it should not be in production, people. Oh, my God. I worked at an unnamed company once, and they had one of the main records is Bruce Wayne. And you're like, why is this Bruce Wayne record showing up here? And it's like, when you put fake data into production, you're going to run into problems. Don't do that.
Yeah.
Because then you have to start adding edge cases around those fake users.
Yeah. You're like, you've got your if Bruce Wayne all over the place.
Yeah. Or like, if Batman, do this. If it's Bruce Wayne, do this.
Mm-hmm. That's a good one too, because like in Pay, we have a fake payment processor that's like partially useful for anybody who just wants to write tests that don't hit a real API. But it's also super useful just for production, where you're like, look, all of the admins get a fake payment processor. They all have a fake subscription that has access to whatever we want. We treat it the same as the Stripe subscription, but we don't have to put in a real credit card. We can just like create that fake subscription from the Rails console for whoever, or from the admin area, and do that and treat them as real users, but we can fake the access or whatever and in production in a different way. And like we have it set up so that when you create a Pay customer with a fake payment processor, it's like automatically filtered out by default. And so you have to explicitly call it allow fake processor as true in order to do that. So like there's no way that someone would go through and say, hey, I chose the fake processor on the checkout page. That's just not possible. So it's nice to have those options or whatever. And then you don't have to worry about exceptions in your code and the controller to like make sure that they passed in a valid payment processor. It already does that by default, but having a few of those things in production for admins and customer support and whatever is fine, but you have to make sure you don't go overboard with that.
Yeah. As we're kind of wrapping up here, just to harp back to something I brought up earlier. If anyone out there is like using RBS, feels that their experience with RBS, wants to talk about RBS, I would love to talk to someone about that. Because I've talked to Stripe. I've done at least one podcast about Sorbet. I feel like there's a lot of literature and content out there from Stripe and from other companies. If you want to use Sorbet, like we have there's RailsConf talks, etc. So I'm not as interested in that. I'm very interested in kind of what's happening in the RBS world and people who are trying it and what they're seeing and how they're using it and extending it, etc.
Very much the same with you on that, because you hear about it, things being used in Stripe and Shopify and whatever. And I haven't really seen many projects, like smaller projects or anything, using them yet. And I'd love to try it too and make a screencast on it and whatever. And it would be super fun to talk about that, because there probably needs to be a whole lot more usage of it for more feedback and for more like adoption and everything. So it just would benefit everybody if we got more conversation going around it and more people trying it, I think.
Yeah, I definitely agree.
I want to give a shout out to the new firstrubyfriend.org.
Firstrubyfriend.org.
Yes, super awesome. Although he said there was in the first 24 hours, 155 people offering to mentor, but only 47 applications for mentees. So the important thing that I want to point out is if you're listening and you're a junior or you want to be a Ruby developer or whatever, go to firstrubyfriend.org, because there needs to be more newcomers to the Ruby community. And obviously all kinds of people want to be able to support newbies coming into the community. There's just not enough people coming in. So that I think is a tremendous thing to do. And it's pretty easy if you want to mentor, but I think we just need to get more newbies in there and support them.
I signed up as well. I'm very interested to see how it's going to kind of play out, because I have all these ideas and thoughts that we talked about often about mentoring. And it's like, I feel like it's going to be more challenging if you just put two people in a room and they're like, okay, now you're this person's mentor. And I think especially if you are listening and you're like, I do want, and this is what I'm interested to see is like how they kind of onboard the mentees, or if they're going to like do some sort of onboarding for the mentors of like, okay, this person's really good at this and this person's really good at this, and try to like segment it out. I feel like that's a lot of work that might not happen the first time at least, but I feel like if you are interested in doing this, come with stuff, however they set it up. But if they don't have like specific format or instructions or anything, I would definitely be like, come with questions, come with something you want to work on. Don't just show up and be like, okay, now I'm ready to be mentored, because it's both of you together working together. If you don't know what you're working on, then it's kind of hard to help.
That's the biggest thing that like I'll often get emails from people who are like, hey, I'd love to learn Ruby from you and have you mentor me or whatever. And I'm always like, where are you at? Where are you going? What are you interested in? Do you like know HTTP well, but you don't understand background jobs? Or do you want to learn the front end part of things like TurboLinks and Hotwire and whatever else? That is the context that you need to bring as the junior in the conversation. Just like, here's where I'm at. I don't really feel like I understand HTTP very well. Rails is this cool abstraction and I can build a to-do list, but I don't really get what's going on. Maybe I don't understand Ruby that well. Like, I had never understood the difference between a symbol and a string. I just knew you wrote the symbols when you're doing like the method calls for Rails. Or like, you might realize that, you know, Rails things, but you don't know where the hell do these methods come from? You know, like has and belongs to many and whatever else. They just are something you can call. Then that's going to give the mentor like really good ideas of here's things to do. Go read metaprogramming in Ruby. Go do this. Go do that. And if you're like able to tell them, here's what I know, here's what I don't know, here's what I'm trying to figure out, then it makes the relationship really efficient and much easier to do. And I think that's going to be like really, really helpful, because those people who always came to me were like, hey, I'm doing this. I've tried these things. This didn't work. I didn't understand why it didn't work. Gives a lot of context to give really helpful, specific advice, which will probably do more for those juniors than anything.
Right. I would also say, just remember that there are a lot more aspects to being a developer than coding. And I can't obviously speak for everyone who's going to mentor, but like for me, it's like things like your resume, questions about learning how to communicate more effectively, learning how to debug more effectively. Coming with these non-technical things, I think is also really important to consider, because I mean, those are the things that I almost excel at more than someone's like, hey, can you teach me Ruby? No, I'm still learning Ruby myself, you know? Come with specifics and also consider like other things outside of, here's some code, help me with something.
Yeah. At the end of the day, the code you write isn't really that important. It's a lot of how do you solve the problems and what considerations do you take into account when you're writing that code? Like Colin and I have been doing with Pay all week on the database stuff and whatnot. It's like, what matters here? What do we care about? How are we trying to solve this problem in a way that's consistent? We don't have to deal with this later on. It's reliable and whatever. What are things we care about? What are things we don't care about? We spend more time talking about those things than actually writing the code. It's a lot of, we'll write a little code, we'll review it and be like, if we do it this way, we're going to run up with these pros, but these cons, and maybe there's a way to address that and just have all pros or whatever. And as a junior, you may have a tendency just to be worried about how to make it work. And really, you're looking to learn the thought process, not the code that is correct or anything.
Right.
There is so much more to programming than just the writing of code. You're not sitting there. You're not getting paid to do data entry. Programming is more thinking than anything else.
Right. I mean, anyone can write letters on a screen. So
most everyone.
The last thing I'll say about this is take initiative if you are a mentee, because this is a very much a two-way relationship. So if I go into it and let's say, Chris, you're the mentee and I'm the mentor, and I tell you all these things and I'm like, you have all these questions, I answer them all. I'm like, here's what you should look at next, and like this and that and this and that. And maybe the next week or whenever we meet next, you haven't done any of that. And it's obvious that you haven't done any of that. Well, suddenly now
that sounds like me.
Yeah, same, me too. But for me, that's like a switch in my brain of, okay, well, this person's not going to do anything I say. So what's the point? They're not going to listen to advice, or like, they're not going to take any initiative, or they're not going to come with new questions or this or that. So consider like how you as the mentee, I feel like follow through is important. Even try to make action items for the next time. It's like, okay, well, these are the things that I'm going to figure out. And if there are things that like learning is like, if I were to tell you like, oh, well, I think maybe you should go learn more about CRUD, just basic CRUD. maybe when we meet next week, it would be cool if you then explain to me, okay, well, here's what I've learned about CRUD. And then I can maybe help or fix or alter or help you understand anything more that you want to understand more. And also maybe you got wrong. So
I would want to come back to you and be like, okay, I read this stuff about CRUD. I tried to regurgitate my understanding of it to you, and then you can correct me and like fill in the gaps that the blog posts and YouTube videos and stuff didn't exactly explain right. Or maybe you will have a good challenge of like, it sounds like you got a good idea of CRUD. Go build this thing for next week, and we'll see if you actually understood it. Right. And I think this will teach you X, Y, and Z about CRUD. That stuff is what makes the mentorship fulfilling a lot, seeing the progress. And if you don't see the progress, it just becomes a question of why am I doing this?
Don't forget it's a networking opportunity. I imagine the majority of people who are signing up to be a mentor are probably seniors, maybe high-level mids. So don't forget that these people are likely to have some influence in like their job hunting process. They may be hiring themselves, and that's why they're doing this. And by you showing them that you're like a go-getter and you take initiative and you listen and you ask good questions, like those are the things that I look for when I want to hire a developer. I don't really care about their code as I do care about their code, obviously. Like you need to be able to code, but like any bad habits coding or lacks of like understanding in coding can be taught. It's those other things that are harder to teach because they're more character and personality. So those definitely things that people are optimizing for when they're hired. Like when we pair, are they asking questions? Are they a good pair? Are they communicating? Like, you know, all these other things. So keep that in mind as well, because this person that you wind up mentoring might help you be able to get a job in the future.
Yeah. And I think it can be a little bit nerve-wracking or scary as the mentee. And it's like 100%. When you're interviewing for the first time at a company, like I don't do great in job interviews because I'm nervous. I want to get the job. I don't want to make a mistake in the interview and blah, blah, blah. But that'll tend to like make me not ask as many questions. And if you can treat it as like, hey, we're hanging out and we're friends and we're just going to chat about Ruby, hopefully that can help make it just more, this person might be famous in the Ruby community or whatever, but they're just hanging out with you. Like just treat it like that. Right. Don't worry too much about it. They want to become friends with you and help you and whatever. And it's not as scary as it might feel like.
Right.
But that can be hard to deal with the first few times and stuff.
Well, this person wants to be there because they've signed up. So they're donating their time. So they want to be there. And yeah, I also feel like there's some onus on the mentor to be, number one, never make a sound or a smirk. If someone asks like what you deem may be a dumb question, your response should never be negative. And also maybe just establish up front, like, hey, I will never consider anything you ask me to be dumb. Ask me any question. Don't worry. I don't think you're dumb at all. And the more questions you ask, the better I can help you. So just establish up front, like, hey, I'm not going to shame you. I'm not going to look at you any differently if you don't know something. Like, that's why I'm here.
Yeah. And I think too, along those lines, the person's new and you don't want to be negative about if they ask a question about PHP or something, like, don't be like, PHP is terrible and whatever. Yeah. Like there are trade-offs for everything. And it's interesting to talk about the differences between the languages and everything. And if they don't know if they want to do Ruby or Python or whatever, cool, talk about it. You want to promote Ruby and this is the best or whatever, but it's actually really interesting for the juniors to see the differences between the languages and the thought process that goes into it. There's a lot of culture built into Ruby and Python that's got a different culture, and PHP and so on. And I think a lot of that is really fascinating for newcomers to find their community. Like I found Python first and it was cool, but it had a sort of like similar to Debian Linux. There's one right way to do things and we stick to that and whatever. And then I came to Ruby and it was like, imagine you could do anything any way you wanted. And that was interesting to me. And I latched onto this community a lot more because of that. And who knows, might not be the person's same community that they want, but it's interesting to just make sure that they have an understanding of no technology is really bad. They're all done and designed for different purposes, different times when they were created. So they like have influence from them and whatever. And there's really no bad choices. JavaScript isn't bad. We might joke about it being terrible sometimes. And there are traits of it that are like frustrating, which is what we're joking about. But like, those are interesting growing pains to talk to them about. Like, we've built Bundler in Ruby and it's actually phenomenal. But JavaScript introduced packages and they are still figuring it out in a different way than we are. And it's not bad or anything that they have to change their framework every week.
Yeah, not bad at all. I want to highlight something you said, and I think we could probably end on this, is that promote the community. You as a mentor are there as a representative of the community. We want people to join the community, right? So show them the community. Show them the podcasts you listen to. Show them the Go Rails episodes you listen to. Show them like the things you like on YouTube. Show them people you follow on Twitter, the Reddits, any part of the community that you enjoy, like Discords that you really like. And show them the conferences that you enjoy, because most of the conferences for Ruby have like student scholarships. So I always try to give away several free tickets, and a lot of people have joined me on that journey for each conference. And so there's opportunities for them to attend those things. Don't not tell them about, hey, have you ever thought about, like, if you ever want to come to a conference, it's like, these are the really good ones that I really like. Show them the ways that they may be able to attend for free.
I remember joining like Twitter back in the early days, and it was a lot about, here's a list of 10 people who are the influential Ruby developers on Twitter and whatever, and give them that list of people you follow, give them Nate Berkopeck's email newsletter and start getting them influenced by whoever, as long as that's what they're interested in and want to get absorbed in, then that stuff shows them that there's a community of people, and we have all these different people who are interested in different things and expertises in them. And we're all here together to support each other in different ways. It's not like we're all here as Rails developers. There are people doing all kinds of interesting things in different areas of Ruby, or all the people who are like building Ruby itself. And that's not writing Ruby, but they're creating Ruby, which is really cool. That is some of my favorite stuff. That you're writing C a lot, but to create Ruby, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, I think that's it for us. Chris, you got anything else?
No, that was a long episode, but it was a good one.
Yeah, hopefully y'all enjoyed it. Don't forget, if you're an RBS expert, we want to talk to you. So we'll talk to y'all next week. Bye.
Later.